I'm Frank Miller, 76 years old, and I'm a World War II veteran who spent Christmas Day 2024 completely alone with nothing but a cold turkey sandwich. After serving my country in the Pacific Theater and raising 4 children as a single father, following my wife's death, I thought my family would always be there for me. But this Christmas morning, I woke up to an empty house and a note on my kitchen counter that shattered my heart. Dad, we decided to spend Christmas at Jennifer's new house. There's a sandwich in the fridge. We'll call you later. What they didn't know was that I had been keeping a secret for over 30 years, one that would change everything they thought they knew about their broke old father. Because sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who deserve the biggest wake-up call. Like and subscribe if you've ever been overlooked by your own family, because you'll want to hear this story. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence in my house was deafening. I folded that note carefully and set it back on the counter, my hands trembling slightly. Not from age, but from the weight of what those few careless words represented. 35 years of sacrifice, reduced to a sandwich in the fridge and a promise to call later that never came. I walked through the rooms slowly, each one echoing with memories of Christmases past. The living room where we used to gather around our modest tree, 4 excited children tearing through wrapping paper while Margaret laughed from the kitchen, the smell of her famous cinnamon rolls filling the air. The dining room table where we'd sit for hours after Christmas dinner playing board games and listening to holiday music on the old radio that still sat in the corner, silent now for decades. Margaret. Even now, all these years later, I still kept her wedding ring in the small velvet box on my nightstand. I'd proposed to her with my grandfather's ring in 1965, 2 years after I came back from the war, still carrying shrapnel in my left leg and nightmares that would wake me up screaming. She never flinched, never complained about the night terrors, or the way I'd sometimes stare off into nothing, lost in memories of Iwo Jima. That ring represented everything good in my life: love, commitment, the promise that someone would always be there. When the cancer took her in 1989, I thought my world had ended. Jennifer was only 16, the twins Michael and David were 14, and little Sarah was just 12. 4 kids who needed their father to be strong when all I wanted to do was curl up and die alongside the woman who had been my anchor for 24 years. Margaret made me promise, in those final weeks, that I'd take care of our babies, no matter what it cost me. But I didn't have that luxury of grief. I had mouths to feed, school clothes to buy, homework to check, and teenage hearts to mend. I worked the day shift at the automotive plant and took on weekend construction jobs to make ends meet. The kids never knew about the nights I sat at this same kitchen table, going through bills and trying to figure out how to stretch every dollar, how to make Christmas magical on a shoestring budget. They saw their old man in his work clothes, grease under his fingernails, driving a beat-up Ford pickup that broke down more often than it ran. They watched me shop with coupons, buy generic brands, and wear the same 3 shirts to work for years. What they didn't see was the careful planning, the strategic thinking I'd learned in the Marines, being applied to every financial decision I made. Every penny saved was a penny that could go toward their future. I raised them the best I could, teaching them values I'd learned the hard way: respect, hard work, the importance of family. I went to every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every graduation. I walked Jennifer down the aisle when she married that investment banker she met in college. I helped the twins start their own businesses. I watched Sarah become a successful doctor, proud as any father could be. Somewhere along the way, they started seeing me as the family charity case. The poor old dad who struggled to make ends meet, who needed their help and pity. Jennifer would slip me $50 at family gatherings, whispering that I shouldn't be too proud to accept help. The twins would offer to fix things around the house, talking about me like I was fragile and helpless. Sarah would bring me groceries, acting like she was doing me some great favor. I let them think it because I was proud of their success. As I sat in my quiet house, my mind drifted back to another time when I felt truly alone. February 1945, on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. I was 19 years old, a Marine private with the 28th Regiment, and I thought I knew what fear was until I heard the whistle of incoming artillery shells. The battle lasted 36 days, though it felt like a lifetime. I can still smell the sulfur from the volcanic rock, still hear the screams of wounded Marines calling for their mothers. On day 23, a Japanese mortar shell exploded 15 feet from our foxhole. The concussion threw me against the rocks, and shrapnel tore through my left leg and embedded in my back as I lay there bleeding, watching my buddies continue fighting while corpsmen worked to keep me alive. I learned something about being forgotten. In war, you realize how quickly the world moves on without you. One minute you're essential to your unit, the next you're a casualty number in a field report. The Purple Heart they gave me later was nice, but it didn't take away the lesson I learned about how easily people become invisible, even to those who are supposed to care about them. I kept that medal in an old shoebox in my closet for 79 years. Never displayed it, never bragged about it. My kids knew I served in the war, but they never asked for details, and I never volunteered them. Some memories are too heavy to share, especially with children who've never had to face real hardship. That Purple Heart wasn't just a piece of metal and ribbon. It was proof that I had survived when others didn't, that I had earned my place in this world through blood and sacrifice. The Marines taught me that survival isn't just about being tough. It's about being smart, patient, and strategic. When you're pinned down by enemy fire, you don't panic. You observe, you plan, you wait for the right moment to act. You learn to see the big picture while paying attention to every small detail that might save your life or the lives of your brothers beside you. Those lessons served me well as a single father. Every financial decision, every sacrifice I made for my children was calculated with the same precision I used to survive combat. I learned to endure discomfort and loneliness because I had a mission, raising my children to be decent human beings who understood the value of family, sacrifice, and loyalty. But lying in that hospital bed in 1945, drifting in and out of consciousness from morphine, I swore I'd never let myself become invisible again. I promised myself that when I got home, I'd build something meaningful, something that would matter. I'd create a legacy that couldn't be ignored or forgotten, something that would prove my life had meaning beyond just surviving another day. Sitting in my empty house on Christmas Day 2024, I realized I'd kept that promise in ways my children couldn't imagine. But I'd also learned that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones most likely to make you disappear. The enemy on Iwo Jima was honest about wanting to kill me. My own children had simply forgotten I existed, which somehow felt worse. The loneliness I felt that Christmas morning was different from combat loneliness. In war, you're surrounded by brothers who would die for you, men who understand sacrifice and honor. At home, I was surrounded by family who couldn't even spare a phone call. By noon, I was still sitting by that old rotary phone, the same black, big light model I'd had since 1978. It had been Margaret's idea to keep it when everyone else was switching to those cordless things. "This phone has character, Frank," she'd said, running her fingers along its smooth surface. "It's built to last, just like us." Now it sat silent on the kitchen counter, a monument to broken promises and forgotten obligations. I kept glancing at it every few minutes, willing it to ring. They said they'd call later, didn't they? But later had stretched into hours, and the silence was becoming deafening. I thought about all the times that phone had brought good news. Jennifer calling to say she got into law school, the twins phoning to tell me about their first big business contracts, Sarah's voice bubbling with Excitement when she matched into her residency program. This same phone had also carried the worst news of my life. The call from the hospital at 3:47 a.m. on March 15th, 1989, telling me that Margaret's condition had taken a turn for the worse. The doctor's voice, professionally calm, but tinged with the weight of delivering devastating news to yet another family. "Mr. Miller, I think you should come in now." I remembered rushing to the hospital in my pajamas and work boots, my heart hammering against my ribs. Margaret was unconscious when I got there, the cancer having spread faster than anyone anticipated. I held her hand for 6 hours until she slipped away at 9:23 a.m., taking half my soul with her. That phone call changed everything, turned me. From a husband into a widower, from a co-parent into a single father, carrying the entire weight of 4 young lives. But there had been happier calls too. Jennifer at 16, whispering into the phone about her first boyfriend. The twins calling from their high school football games, shouting over crowd noise that they'd scored touchdowns. Sarah, homesick. From school, asking me to come home early because she missed me. Back then, that phone was a lifeline connecting our family even when we were apart. Now it was just a relic, like me. When was the last time any of them had actually called just to talk? Not to ask for advice about their careers or to update me on their busy lives, but just to hear their old man's voice. I couldn't remember. Somewhere along the way, I'd become an obligation to check off their lists rather than someone they wanted to spend time with. I thought about Jennifer, probably hosting Christmas dinner in her McMansion in Westchester County. Her investment banker husband carving turkey while she fussed over her perfectly coordinated table settings. The twins were likely at their respective homes with their families, opening expensive gifts and posting pictures on social media. Sarah was probably at her boyfriend's place, the surgeon she'd been dating for 2 years but still hadn't brought home to meet her father. None of them were thinking about their old man sitting alone with a cold sandwich, waiting for a phone call. That would never come. Around 2 o'clock, hunger finally drove me to the refrigerator. There it was, exactly as promised. A turkey sandwich wrapped in plastic wrap, sitting lonely on the middle shelf between a carton of milk that was 2 days past its expiration date and some leftover Chinese takeout from 3 nights ago. The sandwich looked as pathetic as I felt. I unwrapped it slowly, examining their handiwork. 2 slices of generic white bread, a thin layer of mayonnaise, 3 small pieces of dry turkey, and a wilted piece of lettuce. No cranberry sauce, no stuffing, none of the traditional Christmas flavors that had once filled this house. This wasn't a meal. It was an afterthought, something thrown together to ease their collective conscience. I sat down at the kitchen table, where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. This same table where I'd helped 4 children with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes, where Margaret had taught me to play bridge during those quiet evenings after the kids were grown. Now I was eating a sad sandwich, alone, while my family feasted somewhere else. The turkey was as dry as cardboard, but I chewed methodically, remembering Christmas dinners from years past. Margaret always insisted on doing everything from scratch. The 20-pound turkey that took her all day to prepare, homemade stuffing with sage and sausage, mashed potatoes so creamy they could have been served in a 5-star restaurant. Sweet. Potato casserole with marshmallows that the kids fought over. Green bean casserole that even I, a man who'd lived on sea rations in the Pacific, thought was delicious. After Margaret died, I'd tried to keep up the tradition. Those first few years were disasters. Burned turkeys, lumpy gravy, stuffing that somehow managed to be both soggy and dry at the same time. But I kept trying because Christmas dinner meant family, and family was all I had left. The kids were patient with my culinary failures, Jennifer even offering to take over the cooking, but I insisted on doing it myself. It was my way of keeping Margaret's memory alive, of proving I could still take care of my family. By the mid-1990s, I'd gotten pretty good at it. Not Margaret-level good, but respectable. The kids would bring their dates, then their spouses, then their children. The table would stretch from the dining room into the living room, covered with mismatched tablecloths and whatever chairs I could scrounge up. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. When did that stop? When did my Christmas dinners become burdens they needed to escape from? I tried to pinpoint the exact moment when they stopped looking forward to coming home for the holidays and started treating it like an obligation. Maybe it was when Jennifer moved to New York and started talking about how quaint my traditions were, or when the twins got successful enough to afford their own elaborate celebrations, or when Sarah started dating people who made her embarrassed about her blue-collar roots. The sandwich tasted like betrayal, like 35 years of sacrifice reduced to processed meat and stale bread. I took another bite and felt tears starting to form in my eyes. The first time I'd cried since Margaret's funeral. After finishing that miserable sandwich, I found myself walking down the hallway toward the one room in the house my children had never really explored, my study. They assumed it was just storage, filled with old paperwork and junk I was too stubborn to throw away. If they'd bothered to look closer, they might have noticed that the door had a deadbolt lock, something unusual for an interior room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small brass key I'd carried every day for 30 years. It was worn smooth from handling, warm from being close to my body. This key represented more than just access to a room. It was the key to my real life, the life I'd built in secret while they thought I was just getting by. The lock turned with a soft click and I stepped inside. The room was exactly as I'd left it 3 days ago, organized, clean, purposeful. Built-in bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled not with novels or family photos, but with financial journals, real estate publications, and investment guides. The 4th wall was dominated by a large filing cabinet and a desk that had seen decades of careful planning. This wasn't the cluttered storage room my children imagined. This was the command center of a financial empire they never knew existed. Every surface was covered with the tools of serious wealth building: calculators, property surveys, stock charts, and legal documents. The computer on the desk was more sophisticated than anything they'd seen me use, connected to multiple monitors that tracked market movements and property values in real time. I sat down in the leather chair behind the desk and looked around at what I'd accomplished. 30 years of careful planning, strategic investing, and disciplined saving had created something remarkable. While my children saw a struggling widower living paycheck to paycheck, I'd been quietly building an empire that would have impressed even their successful spouses. The irony wasn't lost on me. They thought they'd surpassed their old man, that their college educations and professional careers had lifted them above my blue-collar limitations. Jennifer with her law degree, the twins with their business ventures, Sarah with her medical practice. They all looked down at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. Poor old Dad, working in the factory, driving that beat-up truck, shopping with coupons. But here in this room, I was Frank Miller, the investor, the property mogul, the strategic thinker who turned every hard-earned dollar into 10 more. This room contained the proof that a Marine's discipline, a working man's frugality, and a widower's determination could build something extraordinary. I pulled out a thick folder from the top drawer and opened it on the desk. The first document was a property deed dated 1985, the duplex I'd bought with my first real estate investment. I remembered walking through that rundown building, seeing potential where others saw problems. The seller was desperate, the price was right, and I had the vision to see what it could become. That duplex had been the foundation of everything else. The rental income helped me buy the second property, then the third. Each purchase was carefully calculated, each renovation planned to maximize value. While other men my age were spending their money on boats and vacations, I was building wealth that would last generations. The brass key felt heavier in my hand as I realized that tomorrow everything would change. I opened the second drawer and pulled out a leather-bound portfolio that contained the crown jewel of my financial empire, my real estate holdings. The portfolio was thick, heavy with the weight of decades of strategic acquisitions. Each property deed represented not just an investment, but a carefully calculated move in a game my children never realized I was playing. The first section contained residential properties, 43 rental units spread across the county, from modest apartments in working-class neighborhoods to upscale condominiums near the university. I'd started small with that first duplex. In 1985, using the GI Bill benefits I'd never touched for education to secure favorable financing. While other veterans were buying motorcycles or taking vacations, I was studying property values and neighborhood development patterns. Each property purchase had a story. The 4-unit apartment building I bought in 1987 when the owner was facing foreclosure. I'd offered him a fair price and enough time to find alternative housing for his family. The strip of townhouses I acquired in 1991 when the developer needed quick cash for another project. The converted warehouse lofts I purchased in 1994, years before anyone else saw the potential in downtown revitalization. I flipped through the pages, seeing my net worth grow on paper with each acquisition. By 1995, I owned 12 properties. By 2000, it was 26. By 2010, 38. The rental income alone was more than most people made in their regular jobs, but I'd lived off my factory wages and reinvested every penny. The commercial properties section was even more impressive. 3 small office buildings, 2 warehouses, and a shopping plaza that I'd bought when the anchor tenant was struggling. I'd spent 2 years courting new businesses, upgrading the facilities, and turning it into one of the most desirable retail locations in the county. The monthly rent from just that plaza exceeded what I used to make in a year at the factory. Then there were the development deals. Land purchases that seemed worthless at the time, but were positioned perfectly for future growth. I'd bought 60 acres of farmland in 1988 when the farmer's son didn't want to continue the family business. Everyone thought I was crazy. What would an old factory worker want with farm property? 20 years later, when the county extended water and sewer lines out that direction, I sold 40 acres to a housing developer for 30 times what I'd paid for the entire parcel. I kept detailed records of everything, not just for tax purposes, but because I wanted to understand exactly how my wealth was growing. The current market value of my real estate portfolio was approaching $12 million. $12 million. And my children thought I needed their charity. The most satisfying part wasn't the money itself, it was the strategy behind it. Every purchase had been researched, every decision calculated. I'd driven past properties for months before making offers, studying traffic patterns and development trends. I'd spent weekends at county planning meetings, learning about zoning changes and infrastructure projects. While my children were building their careers, I was building an empire. The property management had been challenging at first, but I'd learned to delegate. I had relationships with contractors, property managers, and real estate agents who handled the day-to-day operations. My tenants knew me as a fair but firm landlord who maintained his properties well and respected their right to peaceful enjoyment of their homes. What amazed me most was how invisible this success had been to my family. They saw me driving my old truck to collect rent checks and assumed I was barely scraping by. They never asked why I always seemed to have cash for emergencies or how I'd managed to pay for their college educations without taking loans. They just assumed their old man was getting by on Social Security and whatever small pension the factory provided. The portfolio contained one final surprise: the development project I'd been working on for the past 5 years. A mixed-use complex combining retail, office space, and luxury apartments on a prime piece of downtown real estate. When it was completed next year, it would add another $4 million to my net worth. From the bottom drawer, I retrieved an old cigar box that Margaret had given me for my 40th birthday. She'd laughed when she presented it, saying every important man needed a place to keep his important papers. Little did she know how prophetic those words would be. Inside this modest wooden box were stock certificates that represented the other half of my hidden fortune. The certificates were beautiful in their own way, ornate borders, elegant typography, official seals that spoke of corporate legitimacy and American capitalism at its finest. But their beauty paled in comparison to their value. These weren't just pieces of paper. They were proof that a factory worker with a high school education could outperform Wall Street professionals when armed with patience, discipline, and common sense. The oldest certificate was from 1975. 100 shares of IBM that I'd purchased for $4,800 using money I'd saved from working overtime. Margaret had questioned the wisdom of that investment. We needed a new washing machine, and here I was, buying shares in a company that made computers bigger than our entire kitchen. But something about IBM's business model appealed to me. They weren't just selling machines. They were selling solutions to problems that businesses didn't even know they had yet. That single IBM investment had split multiple times over the decades. What started as 100 shares had become 800 shares, worth more than $120,000. But IBM was just the beginning. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, I'd continued buying stocks in companies I understood. Microsoft, when personal computers started appearing in offices. Walmart, when I saw how efficiently they operated their stores. McDonald's, because I understood the power of consistency and franchising. I'd made mistakes, of course. I'd bought shares in several companies that went bankrupt or were acquired for less than I'd paid. But my wins far outweighed my losses because I never invested money I couldn't afford to lose, and I never sold during market downturns. When other investors were panicking during the crashes of 1987, 2000, and 2008, I was buying more shares at bargain prices. The real surprise in the box was a certificate for Apple Computer, purchased in 1997 when the company was nearly bankrupt and most analysts considered it a lost cause. I'd bought 1,000 shares for $4,300, drawn to the company's focus on design and user experience. Everyone said I was crazy. Apple was finished, Microsoft had won the computer wars. Why throw good money after bad? 27 years later, those Apple shares had split multiple times and were worth over $2.8 million. The dividend income alone from Apple exceeded my old factory salary. I'd watched Steve Jobs return to the company, launch the iMac, then the iPod, then the iPhone. Each product release had added value to my holdings while my children remained oblivious to my growing wealth. My stock portfolio also included positions in companies that had become household names: Amazon, Google, Netflix, Tesla. In each case, I'd identified the investment opportunity years before it became obvious to mainstream investors. I wasn't lucky, I was observant. I watched how businesses operated, how consumers behaved, how technology was changing the world. The total value of my stock holdings was approaching $4.2 million, bringing my combined net worth to over $16 million. $16 million accumulated by a man his children thought was living on Social Security and food stamps. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so heartbreaking. I carefully placed the certificates back in the cigar box, thinking about Margaret's words all those years ago. She'd been right about needing a place for important papers, but she couldn't have imagined how important these particular papers would become. These certificates represented more than wealth. They were proof that intelligence and determination mattered more than formal education or family connections. My children had achieved professional success through their degrees and career ambitions, but none of them had built the kind of generational wealth that could change their families' futures for decades to come. That was something their poor old dad had accomplished while they weren't paying attention. I walked to my closet and pulled out the old canvas work bag I'd carried to the factory for 23 years. Inside were my worn work clothes, the blue uniforms with Frank embroidered over the pocket, steel-toed boots that had protected my feet through countless shifts, and the hard hat that had saved my skull more than once when equipment malfunctioned. These clothes told a story my children thought they knew. To them, these uniforms represented limitation, a man trapped in manual labor because he lacked better options. They'd grown up watching me come home exhausted, grease under my fingernails, smelling of machine oil and industrial soap. When they looked at these clothes, they saw everything they'd worked to escape from, but they'd never understood what these uniforms really represented. Every shift I worked in these clothes had been a choice, not a necessity. Even after my real estate investments started generating substantial income, I kept going to the factory. Even after my stock portfolio could have supported a comfortable retirement, I kept punching that time clock. Why? Because these clothes represented something more valuable than money. They represented integrity. My co-workers respected me because I showed up every day, did my job well, and never acted like I was better than anyone else. When the factory was struggling in the late 1990s and management was looking for excuses to lay people off, I was one of the last workers they'd consider cutting because my reliability was unquestioned. My children saw poverty where I saw strategy. Living below my means wasn't about lacking options. It was about building wealth systematically while maintaining the relationships and values that mattered to me. The factory job provided structure, purpose, and credibility in my community. More importantly, it provided cover for my investment activities. Nobody questions a factory worker's modest lifestyle. Nobody expects elaborate vacations or expensive cars. Nobody wonders how someone living paycheck to paycheck manages to have cash available for investment opportunities. My blue-collar image was the perfect camouflage for building serious wealth. Remembered the day Jennifer graduated from law school. She'd pulled me aside after the ceremony and said, "Dad, I'm so proud that you sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities you never had." The comment stung because it revealed how completely she misunderstood my life. I hadn't sacrificed everything. I'd chosen everything. I'd chosen to work in the factory, chosen to live modestly, chosen to invest wisely, and chosen to let my children believe what they needed to believe about their old man. The twins had made similar comments over the years, always with that tone of gentle condescension that made it clear they saw me as someone to be pitied rather than respected. "We know how hard it was for you after Mom died," Michael had said when his business started taking off. "You did the best you could with what you had." As if what I had was somehow insufficient, as if my best wasn't good enough. Sarah was the worst. As a doctor, she'd appointed herself the family expert on everything, including my financial situation. She'd started bringing me groceries without asking, acting like she was saving me from malnutrition. She'd suggested I apply for senior discounts and government assistance programs, never bothering to ask if I actually needed help. The most insulting part was how they'd started making decisions about my life without consulting me. Last Thanksgiving, I'd overheard them discussing whether I could still live alone safely. Jennifer thought I should move to a senior community. The twins worried about me driving that old truck. Sarah wanted me to get one of those medical alert devices in case I fell and couldn't get up. They'd forgotten that this helpless old man had survived combat in the Pacific, raised 4 children as a single father, and built a financial empire worth more than their combined net worth. These work clothes had been my uniform during the most productive and successful period of my life, and my children saw them as evidence of failure. That Christmas evening, as the reality of my abandonment settled in, I found myself reaching for a yellow legal pad I kept in my desk drawer. The pad was nothing special, the kind lawyers and businessmen used for taking notes and drafting contracts. But as I stared at its blank pages, I realized this ordinary notepad was about to become the instrument of the most important plan I'd ever conceived. I'd learned in the Marines that successful operations required careful planning. You don't charge into battle without understanding the terrain, knowing your enemy's weaknesses, and having a clear objective. What my children had done to me wasn't warfare, but it was a betrayal that demanded a strategic response. They needed To learn that actions have consequences and respect isn't something you can take for granted. At the top of the first page, I wrote, Operation Family Values. The name felt appropriate. This wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching my children the values they'd somehow forgotten along their path to success. Values like gratitude, respect for their elders, and the importance of family bonds. I started by writing down what they thought they knew about me. They believed I lived on Social Security and a small factory pension, that I struggled financially month to month, that I needed their charity and assistance. They saw me as having limited education and business knowledge, as someone dependent on their goodwill and support. Then I wrote down the reality they were about to discover. My net worth exceeded $16 million. I was a successful real estate and stock investor who had achieved financial independence decades ago. I possessed a strategic mind capable of long-term planning, and their inheritance was dependent on my approval. The plan began forming in my mind. This couldn't be a simple revelation. That would be too easy for them to dismiss or rationalize. They needed to understand not just what I'd accomplished, but how their assumptions and attitudes had affected our relationship. They needed to confront their own behavior and make a choice about what kind of family they wanted to be. I wrote down their individual weaknesses and blind spots. Jennifer, despite her legal training, had always been impressed by displays of wealth and status. She'd married her banker husband partly because his family had old money and social connections. Showing her the scope of my financial success would shake her understanding of social hierarchy. The twins, Michael and David, prided themselves on their business acumen. They'd built successful companies and considered themselves sophisticated entrepreneurs. Learning that their blue-collar father had outperformed them as an investor would challenge their professional confidence. Sarah, with her medical degree and scientific training, believed in evidence and facts. Presenting her with documentation of my financial empire would force her to confront how wrong her assumptions had been. But the plan needed to go beyond just shocking them with my wealth. They needed to understand the consequences of taking family for granted. The inheritance they'd probably started counting on would come with conditions, requirements that would force them to reconnect with family values and demonstrate genuine respect for their father. I sketched out the timeline. First, I'd need to arrange a family meeting where I could control the environment and ensure their full attention. New Year's Day seemed appropriate, a time for new beginnings and resolutions. I'd need to gather all the documentation that proved my financial status, organize it in a way that would maximize impact. Most importantly, I'd need to draft new estate planning documents that reflected their behavior and gave them a path to redemption. The inheritance wouldn't disappear, but they'd have to earn it by demonstrating the family values I'd tried to teach them. As I filled page after page with notes and ideas, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose and control. For too long, I'd allowed my children to define our relationship on their terms. I'd accepted their condescension, their charity, their assumptions about my limitations. But that was ending now. The legal pad was filling up with the blueprint for the most important lesson I'd ever teach my children. The morning after Christmas, I drove my old pickup truck to the law offices of Morrison, Walsh and Associates. The building was everything my children would expect to impress them. Glass and steel rising 20 stories above the downtown business district, marble lobby with fresh flowers, receptionists who spoke in hushed, reverent tones. What they didn't know was that I'd been a client here for 15 years. I took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked past the nameplate that read, Thomas Morrison, Senior Partner. Tom had handled all my major real estate transactions and had been trying to convince me for years to tell my family about my wealth. Frank, he'd said during our last meeting, hiding this from your children isn't protecting them. It's robbing them of the chance to understand who their father really is. Today, I was finally ready to take his advice, but on my terms, Tom's. Secretary ushered me into his office, where my attorney was waiting with a familiar manila folder. Inside that folder was my last will and testament, a document I'd updated regularly over the years, but never shared with my beneficiaries. The will represented more than just legal instructions for distributing my assets. It was the culmination of 30 years of hopes and expectations for my children. "Frank," Tom said, settling into his chair behind the mahogany desk, "I have to say, I'm glad you finally called. After what happened Christmas Day, I think it's time your family learned the truth." I'd called Tom the evening after my abandoned Christmas, explaining the situation and asking him to schedule an emergency meeting. He'd been sympathetic but not surprised. Over the years, he'd watched me struggle with the decision to keep my wealth secret, always hoping my children would demonstrate the values that would make revealing it a celebration rather than a confrontation. The original will was straightforward. Everything divided equally among my 4 children, with modest bequests to a few charities I'd supported over the years. It assumed they would appreciate the inheritance, use it wisely, and continue the values I'd tried to instill in them. But the behavior on Christmas Day had shattered those assumptions. "Tom," I said, pulling out my legal pad with the previous night's planning notes, "I want to make some changes. Major changes." For the next 2 hours, we worked through the details of a new estate plan that would accomplish several goals. First, it would ensure my children understood the magnitude of what I'd built and how wrong their assumptions about me had been. Second, it would create incentives for them to reconnect with family values and maintain stronger relationships with each other and with me. Third, it would give them a chance to prove they deserved the wealth they'd inherit. The new will established a complex trust structure. Instead of receiving their inheritance immediately upon my death, my children would need to meet specific requirements over a period of years. They'd need to demonstrate regular family contact, volunteer service to veterans organizations, and genuine effort to understand and appreciate the sacrifices previous generations had made for their success. "This is substantial, Frank," Tom said, reviewing my handwritten notes. "You're essentially requiring them to earn their inheritance by becoming better family members and more grateful human beings." "Exactly," I replied. "They've forgotten that wealth isn't just about money. It's about responsibility, gratitude, and maintaining the bonds that make life meaningful." We discussed the practical details. Each child would receive enough immediately to handle any financial emergencies, but the bulk of their inheritance would be held in trust until they completed their requirements. The trust would fund their activities, family gatherings, volunteer work, education about family history, but they'd need to participate actively and demonstrate genuine change in their attitudes and behavior. The most important change was the addition of a grandfather clause. If any of my children had children of their own, those grandchildren's inheritance would be protected regardless of their parents' behavior. I wasn't going to punish innocent grandchildren for their parents' mistakes, but I also wasn't going to reward my children's neglect. 3 days later, I returned to Tom's office to sign the final documents. The revised will and testament was now a comprehensive 37-page document that would fundamentally change my family's future. But this legal document was more than just instructions for distributing wealth. It was a manifesto about family. It values personal responsibility and the true meaning of inheritance. The new will began with a preamble that explained my reasoning. I wanted my children to understand that this wasn't about punishment, but about ensuring that the wealth I'd built would strengthen rather than corrupt the next generation. Too many families had been destroyed by inherited money that came without wisdom, responsibility, or appreciation for the sacrifices that created it. The document established the Miller Family Trust with specific conditions for each beneficiary. Jennifer, as the eldest, would serve as the trust's administrator, but only if she demonstrated genuine commitment to family unity and spent meaningful time learning about her parents' history and values. Her legal training made her the logical choice for managing the trust's operations, but the responsibility came with obligations. Michael and David, the twins, would need to work together on a joint project that honored our family's military service. They'd have access to significant funding to create a scholarship program for children of veterans, but they'd need to collaborate effectively and demonstrate that their business skills could serve purposes beyond personal profit. Sarah, as the youngest, had always been protected by her siblings and perhaps needed the greatest lesson in appreciation and humility. Her inheritance would require her to spend significant time with elderly veterans, learning their stories and providing support for their medical and emotional needs. As a doctor, she had skills that could make a real difference in these men's lives, but she'd need to volunteer her time rather than simply writing checks. The most innovative aspect of the new will was the family connection requirement. Each of my children would need to host monthly family dinners for at least 2 years, ensuring that our family bonds were rebuilt and maintained. They'd need to involve their own children in these gatherings, teaching the next generation about family history and the importance of staying connected across the generations. The financial structure was designed to be both generous and instructive. Each child would immediately receive $500,000 upon my death, enough to handle any emergencies or immediate needs, but not enough to fundamentally change their lifestyles. The remainder of their inheritance, representing the bulk of my wealth, would be distributed gradually as they met their requirements. If they completed all conditions successfully, each child would ultimately receive approximately $3.8 million, along with their share of the real estate portfolio and ongoing business income. But if they failed to meet the requirements or showed no genuine change in their behavior, their inheritance would be redirected to veterans, organizations, and charities that supported military families. The document also included provisions for my grandchildren's education. Regardless of their parents' behavior, college funds would be established for each grandchild, ensuring that the next generation had opportunities for advancement. However, these funds came with their own requirements. The grandchildren would need to learn about their family history, including their grandfather's military service and the values that had guided his life. "Frank," Tom said as I signed each page of the document, "this is either going to bring your family closer together or create the biggest family crisis in your county's history." "Maybe both," I replied. "But either way, they'll finally understand who their father really is and what he expects from them." The signing ceremony felt momentous. With each signature, I was fundamentally changing the trajectory of my family's future. The old will had been based on hope and assumption, hope that my children would naturally embody the values I'd tried to teach them, and assumption that they'd appreciate the wealth I'd worked to build. The new will was based on reality and requirements. Reality about how they'd been treating me, and requirements that would force them to become the people I'd always hoped they could be. The next phase of my plan required careful orchestration. I couldn't simply call my children and announce that I had something important to discuss. They'd find excuses to delay or avoid the meeting, just like they'd avoided Christmas dinner. Instead, I needed to create a sense of urgency and formality that would ensure their attendance. I sat down at my kitchen table with a box of formal invitation cards I'd found at the stationery store. These weren't the casual email invitations my children were accustomed to sending. These were proper, cream-colored cards with elegant script, lettering that demanded respect and attention. Each invitation would be sent via certified mail, requiring a signature upon delivery to ensure they couldn't claim they never received it. The wording took me several drafts to perfect. It needed to convey both importance and mystery while maintaining the authoritative tone that would prevent them from dismissing the request. "Mr. Frank Miller requests the honor of your presence at a family meeting of utmost importance," I wrote. "Your attendance is required on January 1st, 2025 at 2 p.m. at the family home. This matter concerns the future of our family and requires your immediate attention. I signed each invitation with my full name and added a handwritten note at the bottom. Please confirm your attendance by calling me directly. This cannot be postponed or rescheduled. The formality would puzzle them, but it would also ensure they took the meeting seriously. After addressing and sealing the invitations, I drove to the post office to send them certified mail. The postal clerk, someone I'd known for years, commented on the formality of the process. "Important family business, Frank?" she asked with a knowing smile. "Something like that," I replied, thinking about how accurate her guess really was. The next step was arranging the logistics for what would be the most important family gathering of our lives. I called Peterson's Catering, the same company that had provided food for Margaret's funeral reception 35 years ago. They still remembered me and were happy to prepare an elegant dinner for 5 people, complete with china service and professional presentation. "What's the occasion, Mr. Miller?" the owner asked when I explained what I needed. "Just a family reunion that's been a long time coming," I told him. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. We were about to be reunited in ways none of them could imagine. I spent the afternoon preparing my study for the presentation. All the financial documents needed to be organized in a way that would maximize their impact. The property deeds, stock certificates, bank statements, and investment records had to tell a coherent story of wealth accumulation that would leave no doubt about my financial sophistication. I created separate folders for each major category of assets. Real estate holdings in one folder, stock investments in another, bank accounts and cash assets in a third. Each folder was thick with documentation spanning decades of careful financial planning. By the time I finished organizing everything, my desk looked like the command center of a major corporation. The most important element was the timing of the revelation. I couldn't simply dump all the information on them at once. The presentation needed to build systematically, allowing each piece of information to sink in before moving to the next level of shock. First, they'd learn about my real estate empire, then the stock portfolio, finally, the total net worth calculation that would leave them speechless. I also prepared copies of newspaper articles about some of my larger real estate transactions. Over the years, several of my development deals had been significant enough to warrant coverage in the local business section. My children had never paid attention to these stories, but seeing my name in print as a major property developer would force them to confront how completely they'd misunderstood my life. The final touch was setting up the dining room for our catered dinner. I wanted them to walk into a scene that immediately challenged their assumptions about my lifestyle. Fine china, crystal glasses, professional food presentation, and formal table settings would signal that this wasn't the modest gathering they'd expect from their struggling father. As I worked through these preparations, I felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. This should have been a celebration, a moment when I proudly shared my accomplishments with children who would appreciate what their father had achieved. Instead, it was a confrontation made necessary by their neglect and condescension. But maybe that's what made it even more important. Sometimes the people you love most need the biggest wake-up calls to remember what really matters. New Year's Day arrived with the kind of crisp winter clarity that made everything seem more vivid and important. I spent the morning making final preparations, arranging the documents on my desk in precisely the order I wanted to present them. The financial portfolio binder sat at the center of it all, a thick, leather-bound folder that contained the comprehensive evidence of everything I'd accomplished over 3 decades. The caterers arrived at noon, transforming my modest dining room into something that would have impressed Jennifer's banker husband. They set the table with china I'd inherited from Margaret's mother but never used, crystal glasses that caught the afternoon light like diamonds, and silver serving pieces that hadn't seen daylight since our 25th wedding anniversary. The food they prepared was restaurant quality, prime rib, with all the traditional accompaniments, far more elaborate than anything my children expected their poor father to afford. At exactly 2 o'clock, I heard the first car pull into my driveway. Through the window, I watched Jennifer step out of her BMW, looking puzzled by the certified mail invitation that had brought her here. She was dressed formally, as if she wasn't quite sure what to expect, but wanted to be prepared for anything. Her expression showed the same confusion I'd heard in her voice when she called to confirm her attendance. The twins arrived together in Michael's Mercedes, both wearing business suits despite it being New Year's Day. They stood in my driveway for several minutes, talking quietly and gesturing toward the house. I could only imagine their conversation, probably trying to figure out why their father had suddenly started communicating like a corporate executive instead of the simple factory worker they thought he was. Sarah was the last to arrive, pulling up in her practical Honda with the same bewildered expression her siblings wore. As a doctor, she was accustomed to emergency calls and urgent situations, but this formal family meeting was unlike anything she'd experienced from me before. I watched them gather on my front porch, whispering among themselves before Jennifer finally rang the doorbell. When I opened the door, their collective surprise was immediate and obvious. I was dressed in a tailored business suit I'd owned for years, but rarely wore, looking more like a CEO than the casual retiree they expected. To find, "Dad," Jennifer said, her lawyer's training keeping her composed despite her obvious confusion, "you look very formal today. What's this all about?" "Come in," I replied, maintaining the authoritative tone I'd planned. "We have important family business to discuss, and I think you'll find the conversation illuminating." They followed me into the dining room, where their surprise deepened at the sight of the elaborate table setting and professional food presentation. Sarah actually gasped when she saw the fine china and crystal, probably wondering how her financially struggling father had managed such an elegant setup. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to their chairs. "I've arranged for us to have a proper family dinner, something we haven't done in quite some time." As they took their seats, I could see them exchanging glances, silently communicating their shared bewilderment. The twins kept looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. Jennifer was studying the table settings with the analytical eye of someone trying to calculate what this meal must have cost. Sarah looked genuinely concerned, probably wondering if I'd spent money I couldn't afford on this elaborate production. "Dad," Michael finally said, "this is beautiful, but what's the occasion? Your invitation made it sound urgent." "It is urgent," I replied, taking my seat at the head of the table. "We're going to discuss the future of our family, and I have some information to share that will surprise you." I served the meal with the same careful attention to detail I'd learned in the Marines, making sure each plate was properly presented. The food was exceptional, and despite their confusion, my children couldn't help but appreciate the quality of what they were eating. "This is incredible, Dad," David said, tasting the prime rib. "Where did this come from?" "Peterson's Catering," I replied. "The same company that catered your mother's funeral reception." I thought it was time we had a meal worthy of the occasion. The reference to Margaret seemed to calm them slightly, reminding them that despite my unusual behavior, I was still their father with the same deep feelings about family that had always guided my decisions. But I could see they were still completely puzzled about what was coming next. After we finished eating, I stood up and looked at each of my children in turn. "Now," I said, "it's time for the real reason I asked you here today." I walked to my study and returned carrying the thick financial portfolio binder, setting it down on the cleared dining room table with deliberate ceremony. The leather cover was worn but dignified, marked only with the words "Miller Family Investments" embossed in gold lettering. My children's eyes were drawn to it immediately, though they had no idea what they were about to discover. "Before I open this," I said, remaining standing while they sat transfixed, "I want to return something that belongs to you." I pulled out the Christmas note they'd left for me, the hastily scrawled message that had started this entire confrontation. I placed it on the table next to the portfolio. "Dad, we decided to spend Christmas at Jennifer's new house. There's a sandwich in the fridge. We'll call you later." I read their words aloud, letting each phrase sink in. Those were the only words my children left for me on Christmas morning. Not "Merry Christmas, Dad." Not "We love you." Just instructions. About a sandwich and a promise to call that never came. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Dad," we explained about Jennifer's house. It was complicated with all the family logistics. "Complicated," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Do you know what's complicated? Raising 4 children alone after your wife dies of cancer, working 2 jobs to pay for your educations while building something meaningful for your futures. That's complicated. Christmas dinner isn't complicated. It's a choice." I opened the portfolio to the first section, revealing my real estate holdings. Property deeds, acquisition documents, and current market valuations were organized in clear plastic sleeves, creating an impressive display of financial documentation. For the past 30 years, while you've all been assuming your father was barely getting by, I've been building this. I turned the portfolio toward them so they could see the first page clearly. 43 rental properties across the county, from modest apartments to luxury condominiums. Sarah leaned forward, squinting at the documents as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Dad, what is this? Where did these come from?" "They came from the same place everything worthwhile comes from," I replied. "Hard work, careful planning, and patience. While you were growing up, every dollar I saved went into real estate investments. Every overtime shift I worked funded another. In property purchase." I turned the pages slowly, letting them absorb the scope of what they were seeing. Property after property, each with purchase documents, improvement records, and current valuations. The twins, despite their business experience, looked stunned by the organization and sophistication of the portfolio. "This shopping plaza," I said, pointing to a familiar location. "You've all been there dozens of times. You never knew your father owned it. This apartment complex where Jennifer's friend lived during college, I bought it the year she graduated. The office building where David's accounting firm started their first practice, I've been the landlord for 5 years. Michael was doing mental calculations, his business mind trying to process the financial implications. Dad, if these valuations are accurate, this represents $12 million in real estate assets," I finished for him. "But we're not done yet." I turned to the next section, revealing my stock portfolio. The vintage certificates were protected in archival sleeves, each one representing decades of patient investing and strategic thinking. IBM, purchased in 1975. Apple, bought when everyone said the company was finished. Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all purchased years before they became obvious winners. I let them examine the certificates, watching their expressions change from confusion to amazement to something approaching shock. Jennifer, with her legal training, was studying the documents with professional attention to detail. "Dad, these certificates, if they're authentic and if the companies have performed as well as I think they have, $4.2 million in current stock value," I said quietly, bringing my total net worth to just over $16 million. The silence that followed was complete. No one spoke, no one moved, no one seemed to be breathing. Sarah actually put her hand to her mouth as if she might be sick. The twins looked at each other with expressions of complete disbelief. Jennifer stared at the portfolio as if it might disappear if she looked away. $16 million, David finally whispered. "Dad, this can't be real." "It's real," I confirmed. "Every document, every investment, every property, all accumulated by the man you left a sandwich for on Christmas morning. The man you've been treating like a charity case who needed your help to buy groceries." I closed the portfolio and picked up the Christmas note again. "This piece of paper represents how much you value your father, a sandwich and a promise you didn't keep. But these documents represent what your father actually accomplished while you weren't paying attention." The revelation hung in the air, like smoke from an explosion, and I could see my children struggling to process what they'd just learned. Jennifer was the first to find her voice, her legal training helping her navigate through the shock. Dad, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell us? We've been worried about your finances for years. We thought you were struggling. You thought I was struggling because you wanted to think I was struggling, I replied, my voice steady but firm. It made you feel superior, made you feel like you'd surpassed your old man. It was easier to believe I needed your help than to ask questions about how I was actually doing. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out another document, a contract that Tom Morrison had prepared according to my specifications. The service requirement contract was printed on official legal letterhead, lending weight to what I was about to explain. Your assumptions about my financial situation have led to assumptions about your inheritance, I continued. For years, you've probably figured you'd inherit this house, maybe a small life insurance policy, perhaps some modest savings. You've planned your lives assuming your father had little to leave behind. Sarah was crying now, tears of what I couldn't tell, if was shame, confusion, or grief. Dad, we never thought about inheritance. We just wanted you to be comfortable. Comfortable, I repeated. Is that what you call abandoning me on Christmas? Is comfort what you were providing when you brought me groceries I didn't need, suggested? Government assistance programs I didn't qualify for? Worried about me living alone in a house I own outright? I opened the contract and began reading the conditions I'd established. Your inheritance will not be automatic. Each of you will need to demonstrate that you understand the values that built this wealth and that you're committed to maintaining. The family bonds that should matter more than money. Michael leaned forward, his business instincts engaging despite his emotional confusion. What kind of conditions, Dad? Jennifer, as the eldest, you'll serve as administrator of the family. Trust, but only if you can demonstrate genuine commitment to family unity. You'll need to spend significant time learning about your parents' history, understanding the sacrifices that created this wealth. Jennifer nodded slowly, still processing the magnitude of what she was learning about her father. Michael and David. You'll work together on a scholarship program for children of military veterans. You'll have substantial funding to work with, but you'll need to collaborate effectively and show that your business skills can serve purposes beyond personal profit. The twins exchanged a look that suggested they were beginning to understand the deeper lessons I was trying to teach. Sarah, you'll spend time with elderly veterans, using your medical skills to provide care and support while learning their stories and understanding what service and sacrifice really mean. Sarah wiped her eyes, nodding through her tears. Dad, I want to do that. I should have been doing that already. Most importantly, I continued, each of you will need to host monthly family dinners for the next 2 years. Real dinners like the one we just shared, where our family comes together and remembers why these relationships matter. I explained the financial structure, how each of them would receive $500,000 immediately, but would need to earn the rest through demonstrated commitment to family values. The bulk of the inheritance, nearly $4 million each, would come only after they proved they understood what wealth really meant. If you complete these requirements successfully, you'll inherit generational wealth that can benefit your children and grandchildren. If you fail to meet the conditions or show no genuine change in your behavior, the money goes to veterans organizations that understand the meaning of service and sacrifice. David was shaking his head in amazement. Dad, this is incredible. But why now? Why wait until we hurt you to tell us this? Because hurt was the only thing that finally made me realize you'd forgotten who I am and what I've accomplished. You needed to see the contrast between how you've been treating me and what I've actually achieved. You needed to understand that respect isn't something you give to people based on their bank account. It's something you give to people based on their character. I stood up and walked around the table, placing my hand on each of their shoulders in turn. I love you all, but love without respect isn't enough to hold a family together. You're going to learn what it means to earn your inheritance, and in the process maybe you'll remember what it means to be a family. The room was quiet, except for the sound of Sarah's continued crying, but these weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of understanding, recognition, and perhaps the beginning of genuine remorse for how they'd treated the man who had sacrificed everything to give them better lives. The apologies began slowly, hesitantly, as if my children were testing whether their words could somehow undo the years of condescension and neglect. Jennifer was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I'm so sorry. We've been terrible to you, and we didn't even realize it." She paused, struggling with emotions she rarely allowed herself to show. "I thought I was being helpful when I gave you money. I thought I was being considerate when I suggested senior programs. I never imagined you were watching us treat you like a charity case," I finished for her. "Like someone who needed your pity instead of your respect." Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window as if he couldn't sit still. With the weight of his realization, all those times we offered to help with house repairs, to fix your truck, to take you grocery shopping. You must have thought we were idiots. "I thought you were my children, who had forgotten where you came from," I replied. "I thought you'd become so successful that you couldn't see your father as anything more than an old man who needed taking care of." David joined his twin at the window, both of them struggling with the revelation that their business acumen was nothing compared to what their father had accomplished in secret. "Dad, we're supposed to be entrepreneurs. We're supposed to understand money and investments. How did we miss all of this?" "You missed it because you stopped paying attention to who I really am," I said. "You saw what you expected to see, a factory worker who'd reached his limits, a widower getting by on Social Security. You never asked about my interests, my goals, my plans for the future." Sarah finally looked up from her tears, her medical training helping her process the emotional revelation analytically. "I brought you groceries because I thought you couldn't afford good food. I suggested medical assistance programs because I thought you couldn't pay for proper health care. Every time I tried to help, I was actually insulting you." "You were trying to be good children," I acknowledged. "But good children don't just provide charity. They provide respect, attention, and genuine relationship." "When was the last time any of you asked me what I was thinking about, what I was planning, what mattered to me?" The question hung in the air because we all knew the answer. It had been years since any of them had treated me as someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. I walked to the kitchen and returned with Margaret's old recipe box, a wooden container she'd painted with flowers during the early years of our marriage. Inside were hundreds of index cards covered with her careful handwriting, documenting every dish she'd perfected for our family. "Your mother left us more than recipes," I said, opening the box and pulling out cards at random. "Cinnamon rolls for Christmas morning, pot roast for Sunday dinners, birthday cakes for each of your special days." She left us traditions, ways of showing love through food and time spent together. I handed each of them a recipe card in Margaret's handwriting. "These represent something you've forgotten. Family isn't just about being related. It's about creating traditions, maintaining connections, showing up for each other when it matters." Jennifer examined her mother's handwriting on the card for Margaret's famous apple pie. "We used to make this together when I was little. She taught me to roll the dough just right." "When did we stop cooking together?" Sarah asked, holding the recipe for Margaret's chicken soup. "When did family dinners become obligations instead of celebrations?" "Somewhere along the way, you all got too busy for your old man's simple traditions," I replied. "You started seeing my cooking as amateur compared to the restaurants you could afford. You saw my house as small compared to your new homes. You saw my lifestyle as limited compared to your expanded horizons." Michael returned to the table, sitting down heavily. "We became snobs. Successful snobs who forgot that success means nothing if it separates you from the people who love you. Your mother would be heartbroken to see how we've drifted apart." I continued. "She always said that family dinner was sacred time when we put aside everything else and focused on each other. She made me promise to keep bringing you together, to never let success divide us." David nodded slowly. "We've been failing Mum's memory, haven't we? Not just yours, but hers too. She left us these recipes as a way to remember what really matters," I said. Food prepared with love, shared around a table where everyone belongs, creating memories that last longer than any career achievement or financial success. I looked at each of them in turn, seeing perhaps for the first time in years the children Margaret and I had raised, rather than the successful strangers they'd become. The conditions I've set for your inheritance aren't punishments. They're opportunities to remember who we used to be and who we can be again. Jennifer was examining more recipe cards, her lawyer's composure finally breaking completely. Dad, I want to learn these recipes. I want my children to know their grandmothers. Cooking. I want them to understand what our family traditions really mean. Then we'll start next month, I said. First family dinner will be here, and we'll cook Margaret's pot roast together, all of us. And we'll remember what it feels like to be a family again. 3 months later, I was sitting in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, watching my family prepare dinner together for the 4th time since our New Year's confrontation. The transformation had been remarkable, not just in their behavior, but in the entire atmosphere of our relationships. Jennifer had taken charge of organizing our monthly gatherings, but instead of the corporate efficiency I might have expected. From a lawyer, she approached each dinner with genuine enthusiasm. She'd been learning Margaret's recipes methodically, practicing at home and bringing her own children to help with the cooking. Watching her teach my 10-year-old grandson to roll pie dough, the way Margaret had taught her brought tears to my eyes. The twins were collaborating on their Veterans Scholarship program with an energy and purpose I hadn't seen from them in years. They'd visited my old Marine unit reunion, spending hours listening to stories from men who'd served in Korea and Vietnam. The scholarship fund they were establishing would provide full college tuition for 50 children of military families each year, funded by the trust, but administered with the kind of personal attention that honored the families they were helping. Sarah had thrown herself into volunteer work at the Veterans Hospital with the dedication she'd once reserved for her medical practice. She was spending 2 days a week providing free medical care and companionship to elderly veterans, many of whom reminded her of me. The stories she shared about these men had changed her perspective on service, sacrifice, and what it really meant to live a meaningful life. But the most significant change was simpler than any of their formal requirements. They were talking to me differently, asking about my opinions, my experiences, my thoughts about current events and family decisions. For the first time in years, I felt like my children saw me as a person worth listening to rather than an obligation to manage. Today's dinner was special because we were taking our first family photo in over 5 years. Sarah had hired a professional photographer and we'd all dressed up for the occasion. But unlike the stiff, formal portraits from years past, this photo would capture something real and warm and connected. "Dad," Michael said, carrying a platter of Margaret's famous pot roast to the dining room, "I need to tell you something. That first month, when you laid out all those conditions for our inheritance, I was angry. I thought you were being manipulative, using money to control our behavior. What changed your mind?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Working with David on the scholarship program made me realize something. We'd become successful, but we'd stopped being useful. We'd built businesses and made money, but we weren't contributing anything meaningful to the world. The work we're doing now, helping military families, it matters, in a way our old work never did. David nodded in agreement. It took learning about what you accomplished, both financially and in raising us as a single father, to understand that success without purpose is just accumulation. You didn't build wealth just to have money. You built it to create security for your family and to be able to help others. Jennifer was setting the table with Margaret's china, the same pieces we'd used for our confrontational New Year's dinner. I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately, about how she would have reacted to our behavior, how disappointed she would have been to see us treating you like a burden instead of a blessing. "Your mother always said that families are like gardens," I replied, remembering one of Margaret's favorite analogies. They require constant attention, regular nurturing, and the wisdom to know when to prune away the parts that aren't healthy. We let our family garden get overgrown with assumptions and neglect. Sarah came in from the kitchen, carrying her grandmother's recipe box, now a regular fixture at our family dinners. I've been copying all of Mom's recipes into a digital format so we can share them with the grandchildren. But I'm keeping the originals exactly as she wrote them. Some things shouldn't be modernized. As we gathered around the table for dinner, I looked at each of my children and saw something I'd almost forgotten existed. I saw the family Margaret and I had created together, people who cared about each other and understood that success meant nothing without connection. The photographer captured us laughing together over one of David's terrible jokes, the kind of spontaneous moment that revealed our genuine affection for each other. When I saw the final photo weeks later, I realized it perfectly represented what we'd rebuilt. We looked like a family again, not just related people who happened to share a last name. The lesson I'd set out to teach my children had taught me something too. Sometimes the people who love you most need dramatic wake-up calls to remember what really matters. Sometimes respect has to be demanded before it can be freely given. And sometimes revealing your true strength is the only way to show people that love without respect isn't really love at all. My children had learned that their father was more than they'd imagined, but more importantly, they'd remembered that family is more valuable than any inheritance. As we sat around Margaret's table, sharing her recipes and creating new memories, I knew she would have been proud of all of us. We'd found our way back to each other, and that was worth more than all the money I'd ever accumulated.